Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're putting the spotlight on SpongeBob's loyal pet, Gary the Snail. Even though he doesn't talk much, Gary has had some of the funniest, weirdest, and most memorable adventures in the entire series. In this video, we'll be counting down his very best moments. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment down below your favorite Gary episode. Now, let's dive into the best Gary adventures. In the heart of Bikini Bottom, where the sea sways in gentle rhythms and jellyfish glide like lanterns in the current, there lives a little snail whose quiet shell holds far more than meets the eye. Gary the Snail, SpongeBob's most faithful companion, is often seen napping, meowing softly, or watching the world with wise, unblinking eyes. But beneath that calm exterior, Gary has known moments of adventure, moments where he steps into the spotlight and proves that even the smallest creatures can carry the greatest determination. One such moment came on a day that would be remembered as the Great Snail Race. It all began with Squidward Tentacles, SpongeBob's grumpy neighbour. Squidward, as usual, was polishing his clarinet and humming about his own supposed talents when a flyer caught his eye. Bikini Bottom was holding a snail race, a prestigious event where the swiftest and proudest snails competed for glory. To Squidward, it was the perfect chance to show off. After all, he had a prize snail named Snelly, elegant and well-trained, a snail he believed would leave all others in the dust. With his usual arrogance, Squidward could already picture himself holding the winner's trophy. When SpongeBob heard about the race, his eyes lit up with excitement. To him, the idea wasn't just about winning, it was about giving Gary a chance to shine. SpongeBob adored Gary and believed in him wholeheartedly, though perhaps a little too much. He rushed home, clutching the flyer, and burst through the pineapple door. "Gary, guess what? You're going to be in the snail race," he exclaimed with enthusiasm that filled every corner of the room. Gary simply blinked, offering a calm meow as if to say, "Are you sure about this?" Training began immediately. SpongeBob, in his eagerness, transformed from loving pet owner to strict coach. He set up cones in the living room, painted racing stripes, and barked orders like a drill sergeant. "Come on, Gary! Faster, faster!" he shouted, pushing Gary through obstacle courses. Poor Gary, who preferred quiet evenings and gentle snacks of snail food, found himself exhausted under the weight of SpongeBob's relentless ambition. SpongeBob wanted to prove Gary was the best, but in his excitement, he forgot what Gary truly needed: encouragement, not pressure. Meanwhile, Patrick Star, SpongeBob's best friend, decided he too would enter the competition. But Patrick didn't have a snail. He had a rock. Yes, an ordinary, unmoving rock. With the same blind optimism SpongeBob had, Patrick believed his rock would win the race. He decorated it with eyes and cheered for it endlessly, completely unaware of how absurd it looked. To Patrick, his pet had the same chance as anyone else, and in Patrick's world, maybe it did. The day of the race arrived, and the arena was buzzing with excitement. Colourful banners waved as sea creatures filled the stands, chanting for their favourite racers. At the starting line stood the contestants: Snelly, sleek and confident under Squidward's proud gaze; Rocky, Patrick's rock, sitting motionless but adored by its clueless owner; and Gary, looking a little weary after all of SpongeBob's harsh training. The referee raised the flag, the crowd fell silent, and with the blow of a horn, the snails were off. Snelly moved with elegance, gliding quickly and gracefully, exactly as Squidward had promised. Rocky, naturally, didn't move an inch, though Patrick cheered as if it were in the lead. Gary, at first, seemed sluggish. The days of overtraining had left him tired, and SpongeBob's frantic shouts from the sidelines didn't help. "Come on, Gary! Faster! Push harder!" SpongeBob cried, waving his arms wildly. His words, though meant to inspire, only weighed Gary down further. It seemed the little snail could barely keep up, and SpongeBob's dream of victory began to fade. But then, something shifted. In the middle of the race, Gary paused. He turned his eyes towards SpongeBob, his shell glinting under the stadium lights. It was as if he were saying, "I'm not racing for trophies, I'm racing for myself." Gary drew in a deep breath, fuzz, one red, or as deep a breath as a snail can manage, and pushed forward with renewed strength. No longer carrying the burden of SpongeBob's expectations, Gary tapped into his own determination. The crowd gasped as the little snail began to surge ahead. 1 inch, then another, Gary gained momentum. His eyes focused, his pace steady. He began to close the gap with Snelly. SpongeBob's cries grew louder, but this time Gary wasn't listening. He was racing because he wanted to, because he knew he could. The stands erupted with cheers. Even Patrick, still oblivious, shouted encouragements to Rocky while occasionally glancing at Gary with admiration. As the finish line drew near, Snelly and Gary were neck and neck. Squidward's pride beamed as he urged his snail forward, while SpongeBob leaned so far over the rail he nearly toppled into the track. With one final burst of effort, Gary lunged and crossed the line alongside Snelly in a photo finish. The crowd roared, applauding both snails for their incredible effort. In the end, the judges declared Snelly the winner, but the glory of the moment wasn't about trophies. It was about Gary proving his heart, his resilience, and his independence. SpongeBob realized that his mistake had been pushing Gary too hard instead of trusting him. With tears in his eyes, he scooped Gary up and whispered, "I'm sorry, buddy. You don't have to be the fastest. You're already the best to me." Gary, with a small, gentle meow, forgave him, content in the knowledge that he had shown his strength not just to SpongeBob, but to himself. And so, the Great Snail Race came to an end. Squidward clutched his victory, Patrick carried Rocky proudly as if he had won, and SpongeBob walked home with Gary in his arms, humbled and grateful. That day was not about who was fastest, but about the quiet courage of a little snail who reminded everyone that greatness comes not from trophies, but from heart. In the warm glow of SpongeBob's pineapple, life usually moved with a gentle rhythm. Gary would wait by his bowl each evening, knowing the routine of his owner's cheerful song, a sprinkle of snail food, and a kind pat on the shell. But one day, something shifted. A paddleball challenge arrived in the mail, a silly little offer SpongeBob took far too seriously. Convinced he could break the world record for hits, he set aside everything else to chase it. Hours turned to days, and while SpongeBob's eyes stayed locked on the bouncing ball, Gary's bowl sat empty. At first, Gary waited patiently, meowing softly to remind SpongeBob. When no response came, he nudged his dish, the small sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. Still, SpongeBob never looked away from the paddleball. By the second day, Gary's patience gave way to hunger. He pawed at cupboards, let out louder meows, and tried to catch SpongeBob's attention. Nothing worked. The pineapple felt emptier than usual, and Gary realized he might have to look elsewhere for care. That night, with rain falling softly over Bikini Bottom, Gary slipped through the front door. At snail level, the town looked enormous, lampposts glowing like giant jellyfish, Squidward's house looming like a stone guardian. Gary slid along the quiet streets, uncertain where he was going, but certain he couldn't stay where he had been forgotten. It wasn't long before a voice found him. "Well, hello there, little snaily boo," cooed an elderly fish wrapped in a shawl. Her name was Grandma. She knelt down with a smile that seemed safe, her words sweet as a lullaby. "Why don't you come inside? Grandma will take care of you." Tired and hungry, Gary followed. Her home was filled with cozy comforts, lace curtains, steaming dishes, the smell of cookies in the oven. She placed a feast before him, and Gary ate gratefully until he felt warm and full. "There now," Grandma said softly, tucking a blanket around him. "You're safe here." For the first time in days, Gary drifted off with a satisfied purr. Back at the pineapple, SpongeBob finally looked up from his paddleball to discover the empty bowl. His heart sank. Gary was gone. Panic replaced pride, and SpongeBob ran into the streets, plastering flyers on every corner. "Have you seen this snail?" He begged friends and strangers for help. "Mister, Krabs promised to keep watch." Sandy noted the last place Gary was seen, and Patrick tried to help, though his help mostly meant eating one of the posters. Still, everyone knew how much Gary meant to SpongeBob. As SpongeBob searched, his worry turned into song, T.A., a heartfelt plea that floated across Bikini Bottom. "Gary, now I know I was wrong." The words carried through the water like a message in a bottle, reaching every home and heart. For the first time, SpongeBob admitted to himself how badly he had failed the little snail who had always been by his side. Meanwhile, life with Grandma seemed pleasant on the surface. She doted on Gary with endless bowls of food, constant attention, and soft lullabies. But kindness, when smothering, can feel strange. One afternoon, Gary wandered into a back room and found shelves lined with empty snail shells, carefully polished, preserved, and displayed. He realized with a shiver that Grandma's love came with a dangerous possessiveness. She didn't just care for snails, she kept them forever. That evening, when Gary tried to slip out through the pet door, Grandma's sweet tone turned sharp. "Snaily, where are you going?" she called, hurrying after him. "You can't leave, Grandma. You need me." Gary pressed forward, his shell glinting in the moonlight, heart set on returning to where he truly belonged. Grandma followed, slippers tapping against the wet pavement, but Gary pushed on, determined. On the other side of town, SpongeBob's search had carried him everywhere, from the Krusty Krab to Jellyfish Fields, to every corner of Bikini Bottom. Exhausted, he returned home, shoulders heavy, his pineapple feeling emptier than ever. Stepping into the living room, he whispered, "Gary?" From the shadows came a familiar meow. Gary peeked out from behind the chair, his eyes tired but bright. In that moment, SpongeBob's heart lifted. He fell to his knees, hugging Gary with relief and joy. "I'm so sorry, Gare," he said, tears streaming as he filled the long empty bowl. Gary purred softly, forgiving as always. From a distance, Grandma watched quietly. She loved deeply, but sometimes too tightly, and she knew now this snail already had a family. She turned back to her quiet house, humming to herself. Inside the pineapple, life returned to its gentle rhythm. The paddleball lay forgotten on a shelf. SpongeBob prepared food with a silly flourish, humming his off-key tune, while Gary curled up nearby, comforted by the sound of home. This adventure had shown them both something important. Even when mistakes are made, love finds its way back. For Gary, the little snail who had wandered into danger and found his way home, the pineapple on Conch Street was not just shelter, it was family. In the quiet glow of the pineapple house, evening usually meant calm. SpongeBob humming in the kitchen, Gary curling into his favourite rug, the soft clink of a bowl being set down. But one night, SpongeBob had a different plan. He peered at Gary with cheerful seriousness and said the words that would spark an adventure unlike any other. "It's bath time, Gare." Now, Gary was no ordinary snail. He was smart, patient, and surprisingly good at making his feelings known. And if there was one thing Gary disliked above all else, it was taking a bath. The moment SpongeBob set out a tub filled with warm suds and floating toys, Gary's eyes narrowed. A stubborn meow echoed in the room. SpongeBob, ever the optimist, only smiled wider. "Come on, buddy. You'll feel so fresh and so clean." Thus began a legendary standoff between a determined sponge and an equally determined snail. SpongeBob tried reasoning first. He offered promises of fresh towels, extra snail snacks, even a lullaby after the bath. Gary simply turned away, sliding across the floor as if the conversation had ended. But SpongeBob was not one to give up. He grabbed a bar of soap and a loofah, setting them dramatically on the counter like tools for a grand quest. "This is happening," he declared. What followed was less a bath and more a chase through every corner of the pineapple. SpongeBob coaxed Gary with bubbles that drifted like jellyfish. Gary dodged, slipping under tables and squeezing through narrow spaces, leaving SpongeBob scrambling after him. The living room became an obstacle course. Chairs toppled, lamps swayed, and the rug bunched up in waves behind the determined snail. Every attempt SpongeBob made was met with Gary's calm defiance. A simple sidestep here, a quick slide there, Gary seemed to be 2 steps ahead at all times. SpongeBob tried disguises. He dressed as a nurse, then as a cowboy, then even as a heroic adventurer with a net, hoping to trick Gary into cooperation. Each time, Gary blinked at him, unimpressed, then slid quietly out of reach. The pineapple echoed with SpongeBob's dramatic cries, "For cleanliness! You can't hide forever!" while Gary simply meowed, his steady voice almost smug. At one point, SpongeBob managed to corner him by the bathtub. Victory seemed close. SpongeBob scooped him up with exaggerated triumph and lowered him toward the warm, waiting water. But just as the surface rippled beneath his shell, Gary extended his body, clung to the edge of the tub with all his strength, and refused to let go. SpongeBob tugged, slipped, and with a dramatic splash, tumbled into the bath himself. The room filled with bubbles and SpongeBob's muffled giggles, while Gary calmly slid away, victorious once again. The pineapple became a theatre of slapstick. SpongeBob tried coaxing Gary with rubber duckies, singing silly songs, and even setting up an entire bath carnival, complete with balloons and streamers. Gary, wise and stubborn, continued to resist. At one point, SpongeBob even tried disguising the tub as a racetrack, hoping Gary's competitive spirit from the snail races might tempt him. But Gary wasn't fooled. He simply turned, meowed once, as if to say nice try, and carried on. Hours passed. The living room, once neat and tidy, looked like a storm had rolled through. SpongeBob, dripping with bubbles, sat on the floor, sighing dramatically. "Gary," he said softly, "I just wanted you to be clean and comfy." For a moment, he thought he had failed. But then, something remarkable happened. Gary, perhaps moved by SpongeBob's persistence, effort, or perhaps simply tired from all the excitement, slowly approached the tub on his own. He dipped one feeler toward the water, testing it. Then, with surprising calm, he slid into the bath. SpongeBob gasped in amazement. "You did it, Gare! You're in the bath!" He rushed to grab the soap and sponge, gently scrubbing Gary's shell while humming a lullaby. For the first time all evening, the room was peaceful. The water rippled softly, bubbles drifted lazily toward the ceiling, and Gary let out a relaxed, almost content meow. After all the chaos, he was finally clean. When the bath was finished, SpongeBob wrapped Gary in a warm towel, carrying him like a treasure. "You're the best snail in the world," he whispered, setting him gently on the rug. Gary blinked at him, then gave a small, satisfied purr. The pineapple settled back into quiet. The tub drained, the bubbles faded, and the house glowed with its familiar warmth once again. SpongeBob curled up beside Gary, exhausted but happy, while Gary tucked himself into his blanket, clean and content. It had been a simple adventure, perhaps, but one that showed the little battles of everyday life can be just as epic as grand quests. In the end, Gary had not been forced into the bath. He chose it on his own terms. And that, more than anything, proved what SpongeBob already knew deep down. His snail was not just a pet, but a partner with a will of his own. Life inside SpongeBob's pineapple usually followed a cheerful pattern. SpongeBob would rise at dawn, greet the morning with a giggle, and head off to the Krusty Krab, while Gary stayed behind to nap in sunbeams or slide quietly through the kitchen. To most, it might have seemed like a sponge owned a snail. But anyone who spent enough time in that pineapple knew the truth. Gary was far more than just a pet. In his quiet way, he was the real master of the house. This truth came into sharp focus one afternoon, when SpongeBob, distracted by his endless excitement for jellyfishing and bubble blowing, left Gary alone in charge. At first glance, nothing unusual happened. Gary perched calmly on his rug, blinking slowly as if asleep. But the moment SpongeBob closed the door behind him, Gary's eyes sharpened. His shell gleamed in the sunlight as he slid through the house, not with the laziness of a pet, but with the precision of someone inspecting his kingdom. The living room was first. Gary nudged the furniture back into place where SpongeBob had knocked it over during one of his wild bubble routines. He straightened the rug with a measured slide and adjusted a framed picture on the wall that tilted ever so slightly. With each movement, he revealed what few in Bikini Bottom suspected. Gary wasn't just watching SpongeBob's life, he was managing it. In the kitchen, the evidence grew stronger. Gary knew where every snack was stored, every bag of snail food hidden away in cupboards, and even where SpongeBob had accidentally stashed treats in the freezer. He opened the cabinets with surprising skill, checked the levels of his food, and made sure the bowl was ready for dinner later that evening. It wasn't laziness that made Gary sit quietly when SpongeBob fed him. It was confidence. He already knew it would be done, because he had arranged it himself. One of Gary's most revealing adventures came during the events of Gary Takes Charge. In that story, SpongeBob left him home while he spent the day elsewhere. But rather than simply napping, Gary took it upon himself to run the household. He checked SpongeBob's mail, watered the plants, and even disciplined SpongeBob's misbehaving pet scallop. It was a glimpse into his real personality, organized, intelligent, and perfectly capable of running things without SpongeBob at all. Even Patrick, SpongeBob's best friend, had noticed Gary's quiet authority. There was a day when SpongeBob was fretting over chores, running in circles with too much to do. Patrick shrugged and suggested leaving it all to Gary. At the time, SpongeBob laughed at the idea, but as the hours passed, he noticed that the chores seemed to be completing themselves. Dishes stacked neatly in cupboards, laundry folded with precision, even the floors sparkling as if they had been scrubbed. SpongeBob scratched his head in confusion, never quite realizing it was Gary's doing. Gary also had a way of keeping SpongeBob grounded. When SpongeBob spiraled into over-the-top schemes, whether training for races, building bubble contraptions, or attempting grand performances, Gary was always there with a pointed meow, the kind that cut through the noise. Sometimes it was soft, almost sympathetic, and other times it carried the sharpness of a lecture. SpongeBob, in his boundless energy, rarely slowed down for anyone. But when Gary spoke, he listened. The most telling moment came when SpongeBob once lost faith in himself, overwhelmed by failure. Sitting on the floor with drooping shoulders, SpongeBob whispered, "Maybe I'm not cut out for any of this." Gary slid over and nudged his hand with a steady shell, giving a firm, confident meow. In that moment, SpongeBob smiled again. No pep talk from friends, no speech from Mr. Krabs could lift him the way Gary's simple presence did. It was leadership in its quietest form. At night, when the pineapple's lights dimmed and the ocean outside fell into its lull, Gary could be seen perched by the window, watching the street like a guardian. SpongeBob often snored loudly from his square bed upstairs, dreaming of jellyfish and Krabby Patties, never realizing that Gary was keeping watch. If a strange noise stirred outside, Gary's eyes followed it. If a shadow moved too close to the house, Gary's shell bristled. He wasn't just part of SpongeBob's home, he was its protector. Gary's rule wasn't about control or ego, it was about balance. SpongeBob brought energy, joy, and imagination to the house. Gary brought steadiness, wisdom, and order. Together, they created harmony, each one completing what the other lacked. But in those quiet moments when SpongeBob dashed off to his next big adventure, it was clear who held the house together. One evening, SpongeBob returned from work to find his home unusually neat. The dishes sparkled, his bed was perfectly made, and his mail was sorted into tidy stacks. SpongeBob scratched his head, wondering if maybe a helpful neighbour had stopped by. But then he spotted Gary, resting calmly on the rug, his eyes half closed with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Gary, you really are something else," SpongeBob said softly. Gary meowed in response, neither boasting nor denying, just quietly acknowledging the truth. The pineapple glowed warmly that night, as if the walls themselves understood who truly kept the home in order. SpongeBob might have been the face of their little family, but Gary was its steady heart, the quiet ruler who needed no crown. In his own way, he was the master of the pineapple, and SpongeBob wouldn't have it any other way. In the warm neighbourhood of Conch Street, SpongeBob's two closest companions were his beloved Snail and his best friend Patrick. To outsiders, it might have seemed like Gary and Patrick got along just fine. After all, they often sat side by side in SpongeBob's living room, sharing snacks or watching bubbles float by. But beneath that quiet surface, there was a rivalry. Playful tug-of-war for SpongeBob's attention, and sometimes for snacks too. It began in the simplest ways. When SpongeBob would bring home a box of snail food, Gary expected his usual portion. But Patrick, drawn by the smell and ever curious about new kinds of food, often tried to sneak a bite. One episode showed Patrick boldly scooping Gary's food straight from the bowl, much to Gary's outrage. Gary's eyes narrowed, his shell bristling, and he let out a sharp, indignant meow. Patrick, oblivious as ever, simply shrugged and muttered something about being hungry. From that day forward, the battle lines were drawn. In the Great Snail Race, this rivalry reached new heights. SpongeBob entered Gary into the competition, eager to prove his snail's abilities. But Patrick, in his usual clueless way, decided he too needed a racer. His choice? A rock. He cheered for his pet Rocky with the same enthusiasm SpongeBob gave Gary, declaring his stone the ultimate competitor. The absurdity of it all didn't bother Patrick one bit. And though Rocky never moved an inch, Patrick remained convinced his racer was unbeatable. For Gary, though, the situation was less amusing. His patience was tested as Patrick paraded his champion and teased Gary with exaggerated confidence. Even outside of races, Gary and Patrick's clashes continued. In one memorable moment, SpongeBob left Gary in Patrick's care. At first, Patrick seemed thrilled to have the responsibility. He cradled Gary, cooed over him, and promised to treat him like royalty. But Patrick's idea of pet care quickly went off course. He tried to feed Gary ice cream, then donuts, then pizza, all the while ignoring Gary's very clear meows of disapproval. By the time SpongeBob returned, Gary was exhausted, and Patrick was covered in crumbs. SpongeBob praised Patrick for helping, never realizing just how much Gary had endured. Despite these clashes, there were times when the rivalry softened into something more like sibling squabbling. Gary often seemed exasperated by Patrick, but there were moments of quiet tolerance. On evenings, when SpongeBob hosted movie nights, Gary and Patrick would end up sharing the same blanket pile. Patrick, munching loudly on popcorn, sometimes dropped kernels Gary would casually eat. Neither admitted it, but in those moments, they found a kind of truce. Yet the tug-of-war for SpongeBob's affection remained constant. SpongeBob, full of endless love for both, never noticed how often Patrick leaned in to hog the spotlight. If SpongeBob rubbed Gary's shell, Patrick would lean forward with puppy dog eyes, waiting for the same attention. If SpongeBob praised Gary's intelligence, Patrick would blurt out something silly to turn the focus back to himself. Gary, with his sharp mind, often gave Patrick a side-eyed glance, not out of malice, but as if to say, "Really? Must you always compete with me?" The rivalry hit its peak in the episode Rule of Dumb. When Patrick discovered he was supposedly royalty, he began to act like a king, demanding loyalty from everyone around him. SpongeBob, ever supportive, bowed and played along. Gary, however, wasn't impressed. He treated Patrick's crown with the same disdain he gave empty food bowls. When Patrick tried to command him, Gary responded with a flat meow and turned away. To Gary, Patrick's royal act was just another game, and not one worth playing. SpongeBob may have humoured Patrick, but Gary stood his ground. Still, for all their bickering, there was an unspoken bond between them. Patrick, in his simple way, did care for Gary. And Gary, though often annoyed, tolerated Patrick more than he would most. In their own strange dynamic, they were like siblings, fighting one minute, quietly coexisting the next. One cozy evening, SpongeBob sat on the couch between them, watching a jellyfishing documentary. Patrick leaned against one armrest, Gary rested at SpongeBob's feet. At first, Patrick tried to sneak some of Gary's snacks, sparking a small spat. Gary hissed a meow, Patrick frowned, and SpongeBob shushed them both. But as the movie played on, Patrick dozed off, his head drooping onto SpongeBob's shoulder. Gary, too, began to purr softly, curling closer to SpongeBob's legs. The rivalry, for that night at least, melted into peace. In truth, their squabbles never really threatened their bond. They both loved SpongeBob deeply, and in their own ways, they brought balance to his life. SpongeBob needed Patrick's carefree joy and Gary's steady wisdom. If they fought for his attention, it was only because both knew how much it mattered. And while Gary often emerged the silent victor, cleverer, calmer, and more grounded, Patrick's goofy persistence gave the rivalry its charm. As the lights dimmed in the pineapple that night, SpongeBob smiled at the two most important companions in his world. "Good night, Patrick. Good night, Gare." Patrick snored in response. Gary purred, and SpongeBob drifted into dreams. The rivalry would no doubt spark again tomorrow, maybe over snacks, maybe over a game, maybe over nothing at all. But in that little home on Conch Street, their love for SpongeBob always bound them together, no matter how silly their squabbles. To most of Bikini Bottom, Gary was just SpongeBob's pet snail, a quiet companion who offered little more than the occasional meow. But those who lived close to him, SpongeBob most of all, began to realize there was something deeper in those sounds, something beyond the ordinary. Gary wasn't just responding to the world around him. He was understanding it, weighing it, and sometimes guiding it. In his own way, Gary was a whisperer, a voice of reason in a town that often spun into chaos. The clearest evidence came on evenings when SpongeBob fretted himself into knots. SpongeBob had a habit of worrying over everything, whether he was cooking Krabby Patties correctly, whether Squidward secretly liked him, or whether he had remembered to lock the front door. On such nights, he would pace the living room, babbling aloud. What if Mr. Krabs fires me? What if I'm not good enough? What if I never win a jellyfishing trophy? His square hands flailed, his eyes grew wide, and his words tumbled faster than bubbles in a storm. And then, from his rug, Gary would let out a single sound, sometimes soft, like a gentle purr, sometimes sharp, like a command, always perfectly timed. The moment SpongeBob heard it, he froze, blinked, and seemed to remember that maybe things weren't so bad after all. "You're right, Gare," he'd whisper, calming down almost instantly. No friend, not even Patrick or Sandy, could cut through SpongeBob's panic the way Gary could, with just one note. This quiet influence was most obvious in sleepy time, when SpongeBob wandered through the dreams of his friends. When he stepped into Gary's mind, he was astonished. There, instead of a meowing snail, Gary appeared as a poised, scholarly figure, standing tall in a library filled with towering books. His voice, deep and eloquent, recited poetry and wisdom. "Knowledge is power," Gary intoned, his calm presence radiating authority. The dream revealed what SpongeBob had always suspected. Behind the meows was a mind far sharper than anyone realized. Gary's intelligence also showed itself in subtle ways around the house. He could open cupboards, nudge doors closed, and even arrange things in patterns SpongeBob never noticed. One morning, SpongeBob lost his spatula, a catastrophe of the highest order. He searched the kitchen, the bedroom, even under the couch cushions, all while wailing about lost destiny. Finally, Gary slid quietly to the bathroom, tugged the spatula out from behind a cabinet with his feelers, and dropped it gently at SpongeBob's feet. "Gary!" SpongeBob gasped, hugging him tightly. "You saved me." Gary only blinked, as if to say someone has to keep track of things around here. Even Patrick, who rarely noticed details, occasionally recognized Gary's sharpness. Once, after failing a simple game, Patrick sighed and muttered, "Gary's smarter than me." It wasn't said with envy, just matter-of-fact honesty. And in truth, Gary was often the one keeping SpongeBob and Patrick out of real trouble. When their jellyfishing adventures went too far, or their games spiraled into chaos, Gary's warning meows often signaled when it was time to stop. Neither listened every time, of course, but the wisdom was always there, steady and reliable. Perhaps the most striking moment came during The Thing, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopted a mysterious creature they believed to be dangerous. While they panicked and built wild theories, Gary calmly approached, examined, and meowed with certainty that the monster was harmless. He saw through fear when others could not. It was the kind of clarity only Gary seemed to carry, a quiet ability to see truth beneath chaos. But Gary's role as a whisperer wasn't only about warnings or logic. He carried a strange emotional wisdom too. On days when SpongeBob's joy faltered, from those rare times when work overwhelmed him or friends misunderstood him, Gary would climb onto SpongeBob's lap and rest there silently. No pep talk, no silly distraction, just quiet presence. Somehow, that was enough. SpongeBob would smile again, stroking Gary's shell as though it anchored him back to peace. Others began to notice as well. Sandy, ever the scientist, once remarked, "That snail's got more sense than half of Bikini Bottom put together." Even Squidward, though loath to admit it, sometimes glanced at Gary with begrudging respect. "At least the snail doesn't bother me," he muttered once, but the faintest flicker of acknowledgement passed his face. Gary didn't need approval, but he often earned it, whether others admitted it or not. What made Gary unique was that his wisdom came without pride. He never demanded attention, never boasted of his intelligence. He was content to sit on his rug, to meow at just the right moment, to act only when needed. Where SpongeBob rushed into everything with energy, Gary balanced it with patience. Where Patrick stumbled into trouble, Gary steadied the ground beneath him. He was the quiet whisper in the background of their lives, shaping their choices more than they realized. One evening, after a particularly long day at the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob flopped onto the couch, groaning dramatically. "Gary, what if I mess up tomorrow? What if I burn the patties? What if Mr. Krabs?" A sharp meow cut him off. SpongeBob paused, tilted his head, then laughed softly. "Yeah, you're right. I worry too much." He scratched Gary's shell with a grateful smile. Gary purred gently in return, and the house fell into its usual quiet rhythm. The pineapple might have looked chaotic from the outside, a sponge chasing dreams, a starfish blundering in and out, and a snail seemingly silent on the sidelines. But those who listened closely knew the truth. It was Gary who whispered balance into their lives, not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through calm wisdom, one quiet meow at a time. Holidays in Bikini Bottom were always a spectacle. The ocean lit up with decorations, the streets filled with laughter, and SpongeBob embraced every occasion with the boundless joy only he could muster. Yet, in the midst of all the noise and colour, Gary always found his own small part to play. Though quiet and reserved, he became a steady companion through every celebration, say, a silent witness to Bikini Bottom's cheer, and sometimes the one who reminded everyone what those holidays were really about. Christmas was SpongeBob's favourite time of year. He transformed the pineapple into a glowing beacon, stringing lights across every corner, stacking ornaments until they toppled, and singing carols at the top of his voice. Gary, though less exuberant, shared in the season in his own way. On Christmas Eve, he would perch by the fireplace, or what passed for one underwater, watching the soft glow of lights flicker across the room. SpongeBob often wrapped Gary in a tiny scarf, hand-knitted with love, and placed him beside the tree as though he were part of the decorations. In Christmas, when SpongeBob's wish to spread holiday cheer seemed doomed by Squidward's grumpiness, Gary stayed close. He wasn't loud, he didn't sing, but his gentle presence by SpongeBob's side reminded his owner that hope was never wasted. Halloween was different. The usually cheerful pineapple became a house of cobwebs and spooky laughter, with SpongeBob donning elaborate costumes. In Scaredy Pants, when SpongeBob tried to frighten others with his ghostly disguise, Gary played the straight man to the whole ordeal. While SpongeBob trembled in excitement, Gary watched calmly, his eyes blinking slowly as though to say, "Really, this again?" Later, when SpongeBob's ghost costume fell apart in a most embarrassing way, Gary comforted him with a quiet meow. He didn't laugh, didn't tease, he simply grounded SpongeBob with his presence, proving once again that Gary was the calm in every storm, even those made of fake scares. Valentine's Day brought its own small adventure. In Valentine's Day, SpongeBob went overboard, showering his friends with tokens of love, while Gary remained the steady recipient of simple, genuine affection. SpongeBob crafted a tiny heart-shaped treat just for him, placing it gently in his bowl. Gary ate it with unhurried dignity, reminding SpongeBob that love didn't need to be extravagant. Sometimes it was enough to share a quiet moment, a small kindness. When Patrick's tantrum threatened to spoil the holiday for everyone, Gary stayed out of the chaos, curled calmly in his corner. His indifference was almost wise. He knew that holidays, like storms, passed quickly, and what mattered most was the home you returned to afterward. Even smaller celebrations gave Gary a role. On April Fool's Day, SpongeBob filled the house with pranks, squirting flowers, whoopee cushions, and booby-trapped doors. Gary, unimpressed, slid past every gag with effortless grace, his calm demeanour untouched by SpongeBob's antics. He wasn't fooled once, and his steady gaze seemed to mock SpongeBob's endless giggling. Yet, when the laughter faded and the jokes grew tiresome, Gary's presence reminded SpongeBob that silliness was best enjoyed in moderation. In Frozen Face-Off, a chilly winter competition, SpongeBob and his friends entered a race across the icy ocean floor. Gary, bundled up in a little scarf once again, cheered from the sidelines. He didn't need to compete. His loyalty was enough. SpongeBob's determination to win came partly from wanting to make Gary proud, and when the race ended in chaos, as things often did in Bikini Bottom, it was Gary's calm welcome home that mattered most. The warmth of a snail's unconditional love was better than any trophy. One of Gary's most memorable holiday moments came during SpongeBob's wild attempt to bring Christmas joy to Squidward. SpongeBob's decorations and singing had been met with disdain, and for a moment it seemed like the holiday spirit had failed. But when Squidward finally gave in and dressed as Santa Claus, showering gifts on the townsfolk, SpongeBob's heart swelled with joy. Through it all, Gary watched from the doorway of the pineapple, blinking quietly as the lesson unfolded. Kindness, even reluctant kindness, was the true gift of the season. Gary's way of experiencing holidays was never about the spectacle. He didn't wear costumes, he didn't sing loudly, and he certainly didn't get caught up in the chaos of parties. Instead, he observed, absorbed, and offered a calm centre to it all. Whether SpongeBob was stringing lights until they nearly toppled the house, panicking over costumes, or throwing candy hearts to the entire town, Gary was there as a reminder of simplicity. To him, holidays weren't about the noise or the gifts. They were about the quiet joy of being together. One Christmas night, after the lights had dimmed and SpongeBob had finally fallen asleep in a tangle of wrapping paper and ribbons, Gary curled at the foot of his bed. The tree still glowed faintly in the corner, and the sound of distant carols echoed through the ocean. SpongeBob murmured in his sleep, dreaming of Santa and snow. Gary purred softly, a snail's lullaby, content in the warmth of their little home. For him, that was the true magic of the holidays, not the grand gestures or wild adventures, but the peace that came when the day ended and family remained by your side. Through Christmas, Halloween, Valentine's Day, and every little celebration in between, Gary's adventures were quiet, but they mattered. He was the anchor to SpongeBob's boundless energy, the steady presence that kept every holiday grounded in love and comfort. And while others celebrated loudly in the streets of Bikini Bottom, Gary reminded everyone, or at least SpongeBob, that sometimes the most precious part of any holiday is simply sharing it with those you love. For most creatures in Bikini Bottom, Gary was just SpongeBob's loyal snail, quiet, gentle, and seemingly ordinary. But anyone who paid close attention knew that Gary possessed a surprising number of hidden talents, skills that surfaced in the strangest of moments. Some were clever, others downright bizarre, but all revealed that this little snail carried more inside him than most would ever guess. One of Gary's most remarkable talents was his intelligence. Fans first glimpsed it in Sleepy Time, when SpongeBob entered his friend's dreams. Instead of the simple meowing pet SpongeBob knew in waking life, Gary appeared in his dream as a towering, sophisticated figure in a library, speaking fluent English and quoting philosophy. He moved with dignity, surrounded by endless shelves of books, as though he had been a scholar all along. "Knowledge is power," Gary intoned with quiet authority. It was a revelation. The snail who spent his days napping on rugs and chasing food was, deep down, a thinker, a mind as vast as the ocean itself. But Gary's talents weren't confined to dreams. In everyday life, he showed hints of brilliance in unexpected ways. He could read, for one. In several moments, SpongeBob discovered Gary casually flipping through books or following written instructions with ease. This small but undeniable ability set him apart from nearly every other creature in Bikini Bottom, SMN. Even Patrick, SpongeBob's best friend, couldn't manage that much. Gary's literacy gave him an air of mystery, as though he knew far more about the world than anyone realized. Music, too, revealed one of Gary's secrets. In As Seen on Television, when SpongeBob performed the song The Best Day Ever, Gary joined in with a clarinet, playing with surprising skill. The clarinet, an instrument that Squidward himself struggled with, became, in Gary's mouth, smooth and tuneful. It was a small moment, almost played for comedy, but it raised a fascinating question. How much could Gary actually do if given the chance? He didn't just meow in rhythm or make noise. He played music, true music. Artistic flair seemed to follow him in other ways too. Gary was once shown painting, his tiny feelers holding a brush with grace. The strokes weren't random, but deliberate, as though he had studied technique. And while SpongeBob was quick to celebrate him for any little doodle, Gary's paintings often carried a quiet depth. Was it instinct, talent, or just another hint that his mind ran far deeper than most assumed? Physical skills also set him apart from other snails. In the Great Snail Race, Gary proved his athleticism. Though SpongeBob pushed him too hard at first, nearly exhausting him, Gary still demonstrated determination and surprising strength. Unlike Rocky, Patrick's Rock, or Squidward's dainty Snelly, Gary had a competitive spirit that burned bright. When SpongeBob finally encouraged him with love rather than pressure, Gary sped across the finish line with remarkable speed. It wasn't just loyalty that drove him, it was ability. Gary could push himself to incredible limits when he chose to, yet some of his talents leaned toward the strange. Gary once demonstrated the ability to climb walls and ceilings, his suction-like body defying gravity in ways that startled SpongeBob. Another time, he expanded his body like a balloon, stretching his shell and form in comical ways, proving that even his biology held surprises. These odd talents may have seemed silly, but they made Gary uniquely adaptable, a snail who could handle adventures far bigger than his size suggested. One of Gary's most useful skills, though, was his ability to sense danger. He often reacted before anyone else, warning SpongeBob with a sharp meow or sudden movement. Whether it was plankton sneaking nearby, a storm rolling in, or one of SpongeBob's inventions going haywire, Gary's instincts were almost uncanny. More than once, those instincts saved SpongeBob from trouble. It was as if Gary had a sixth sense, an awareness that set him apart from the chaos-prone world around him. Perhaps his most endearing talent, however, was communication. Though limited to meows, Gary managed to express entire conversations through tone alone. SpongeBob always seemed to understand him, answering back as though Gary's meows carried full sentences. And sometimes they did. In episodes like Dumped, Gary's emotions came through so clearly that viewers could feel them. His frustration, his sadness, his loyalty. A single meow could carry the weight of a speech. It was a rare skill, one that turned him from pet to partner in every sense of the word. Gary even displayed survival skills most creatures lacked, in Have You Seen This Snail? After running away, he managed to navigate Bikini Bottom on his own, finding shelter, food, and even new companionship with Grandma. Though the situation became dangerous, it proved that Gary wasn't helpless. He could fend for himself when needed. His resilience, quiet though it was, showed he had talents beyond comfort and play. And then there were the small, quirky abilities. Gary's capacity to knit, his skill at playing with marbles, his knack for solving puzzles left lying around the pineapple. Each one might have been brushed off as a gag, but together they painted a picture of a snail unlike any other. He was clever, creative, athletic, and oddly resourceful, A.T., a creature who hid his brilliance under a shell of simplicity. At night, when SpongeBob drifted into sleep, Gary sometimes stayed awake, practicing his secret talents. A faint scratch of brush against canvas, the soft hum of a tune, or the quiet rustle of a page turning could be heard in the stillness. SpongeBob, dreaming happily upstairs, never noticed. But Gary was always learning, always growing, adding to his collection of little skills. In the end, Gary's talents weren't about showing off or seeking recognition. They were small treasures, revealed only in moments of need or play. He didn't boast of them, didn't flaunt them. He simply carried them within, surprising everyone when the time was right. And that was the essence of Gary. Quiet, mysterious, endlessly surprising. A snail who seemed ordinary on the surface, but whose hidden talents made him extraordinary in the hearts of those who knew him best. Life in Bikini Bottom was often unpredictable, and while Gary preferred the quiet comfort of rugs and warm food bowls, he occasionally found himself face to face with creatures much larger and stranger than himself. These encounters, though sometimes frightening, revealed Gary's resilience and quiet courage. One of the most memorable was his brush with Puffy Fluffy, a pet that started small but grew into a nightmare. In the episode A Pal for Gary, SpongeBob brought home Puffy Fluffy as a new companion for his beloved snail. At first, the creature seemed harmless, tiny, pink, and even a little cute. SpongeBob was convinced that Gary needed a friend, someone to share his days with, but Gary sensed immediately that something was wrong. His eyes narrowed, and his meows carried warning after warning. SpongeBob, blinded by optimism, ignored them. He insisted that Puffy Fluffy was harmless, even as Gary recoiled in fear. What followed was a nightmare only Gary truly experienced. Puffy Fluffy revealed his true form, a monstrous, many-toothed beast with a snarling face and glowing eyes. While SpongeBob remained oblivious, Puffy Fluffy terrorized Gary at every turn, chasing him through the pineapple, tearing apart his food bowl, and leaving him no place to hide. Gary, though small, refused to surrender. He darted through narrow corners, slid under furniture, and used every ounce of wit to stay one step ahead of the beast. His meows turned from warnings into desperate cries, but still, SpongeBob laughed it off. To him, it was just playtime. The climax came late that night. Puffy Fluffy loomed over Gary, cornering him with rows of gnashing teeth. SpongeBob, finally noticing, gasped in horror. But before he could intervene, Gary fought back. He hissed, his shell bristling, and lunged at Puffy Fluffy with surprising courage. Using his slime trail, he managed to trip the beast, sending it tumbling. It wasn't strength that saved him, but cleverness. Gary proved that even the smallest creature could outwit a monster when pushed to the edge. From then on, SpongeBob never doubted his snail's instincts again. Gary's encounters with dangerous creatures didn't end there. In Sandy, SpongeBob, and the worm, the infamous Alaskan bullworm terrorized Bikini Bottom, destroying landmarks and sending citizens into panic. SpongeBob and Sandy took it upon themselves to face the beast. But back at home, Gary had his own perspective. While SpongeBob boasted about bravery, Gary watched him with skeptical eyes, meowing as if to say, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Though Gary wasn't directly in the battle with the bullworm, his instincts once again proved sharp. When SpongeBob returned, battered and terrified, Gary was the first to comfort him. Curling close, he seemed to say that not all problems could be solved with bravado. Sometimes caution, and knowing when to step back, was its own form of wisdom. Gary also had brushes with smaller, but no less unsettling, creatures. In The Thing, when SpongeBob and Patrick found what they believed to be a monstrous figure, which turned out to be Squidward in disguise, Gary observed calmly from the background. While others panicked, Gary remained still, watching with a level-headedness that suggested he saw through the drama. Where others screamed and fled, Gary's unflinching stare suggested he knew the monster was nothing to fear. Even critters closer to his size became part of Gary's adventures. In episodes like Pet Sitter Pat, when Patrick was left to care for him, Gary faced chaos not just from Patrick's bumbling, but also from the pests and little creatures Patrick invited into the pineapple. Snails, scallops, worms, Ines, all caused a kind of domestic turmoil, yet Gary always managed to maintain control, whether through sheer willpower or clever maneuvering. His resilience against Bikini Bottom's oddest animals only added to his legend as more than just a household pet. The theme across these encounters was always the same. Gary's size belied his courage. Puffy Fluffy could have swallowed him whole, yet Gary held his ground. The Alaskan bullworm was vast enough to flatten entire streets, yet Gary remained steady, watching over SpongeBob when the adventure was done. He wasn't reckless like Sandy, or clueless like Patrick. He faced danger with patience, intelligence, and a strange kind of dignity. One evening, long after the Puffy Fluffy ordeal had ended, SpongeBob sat cross-legged on the floor with Gary perched beside him. "I should have listened to you, Gar," SpongeBob admitted softly, scratching his snail's shell. "You always know when something's wrong," Gary purred in response, closing his eyes as if accepting the apology. For SpongeBob, it was another reminder that his snail was more than a pet. He was a guardian in his own right. In the end, Gary's encounters with worms and monsters weren't about epic battles or grand victories. They were about survival, instinct, and courage. He didn't need to roar like Sandy, boast like SpongeBob, or charge recklessly like Patrick. His strength was quieter, knowing when to fight, when to hide, and when to stand firm. And for a creature so often underestimated, that quiet courage was more powerful than any show of force. Though Gary preferred the calm of his rug and the quiet hum of SpongeBob's home, there were moments when adventure called him beyond the pineapple's walls. These weren't reckless journeys over. Gary was no thrill-seeker like Sandy, nor a blundering wanderer like Patrick, but rather careful, curious explorations. Each time he ventured out, he revealed just how resourceful and brave a little snail could be when the world stretched wide and unknown before him. One of the most striking examples came in Have You Seen This Snail?, the tale of Gary's great escape. When SpongeBob became distracted with a toy paddleball, forgetting his snail's needs, Gary quietly left home, sliding into the unknown streets of Bikini Bottom. His departure was not dramatic, no slammed doors, no angry declarations, just a slow, steady decision. For Gary, exploration was survival. On his journey, Gary wandered past dark alleys, bustling roads, and corners of the city few residents saw up close. He had no Sponge to guide him, no Patrick to distract him, no Sandy to invent gadgets for protection. He was utterly alone. Yet he moved with determination, his instincts guiding him from one place to the next. When he encountered Grandma, a kindly but overly smothering old woman, he found shelter, food, and even affection. For a time, it seemed his wandering had found him a new home. But as comforting as Grandma's care was, Gary eventually realized that it was SpongeBob's love, not endless treats, that he truly longed for. His adventure was not just about exploring the city, but about discovering where he truly belonged. Gary's explorations weren't always so dramatic. In quieter moments, he often slid into the streets of Conch Bottom, trailing behind SpongeBob as he ran errands. While SpongeBob gushed about jellyfishing nets or giddily bounced through the bargain mart, Gary studied the world with keen eyes. He noticed details others missed, the way jellyfish darted through the distance, the shimmer of lights in shop windows, the odd behavior of Bikini Bottom's residents. His explorations were not just physical but thoughtful, as though he were mapping the ocean in his mind. In Gary Takes a Bath, SpongeBob's attempts to clean his snail turned into a battle of wits. To avoid the dreaded bath, Gary explored every nook and cranny of the pineapple, darting through hallways, climbing shelves, and even hiding in impossible places. It wasn't just defiance, it was ingenuity. Gary knew his home so well that he could use it as a labyrinth, turning each corner into a trick that left SpongeBob baffled. That day, Gary was both explorer and tactician, showing that adventure didn't always mean leaving home. Sometimes it meant mastering the ground you already knew. There were also times when Gary joined SpongeBob on bigger outings. During SpongeBob's trip to Jellyfish Fields, Gary occasionally tagged along, gliding across the meadow of stinging creatures with remarkable calm. Unlike SpongeBob, who shrieked with joy and often got himself stung, Gary approached the jellyfish with quiet observation. He seemed to understand their rhythms, watching their gentle bobbing with something like respect. It was as though he were not just exploring a new place, but learning its secrets. One of Gary's most unusual explorations came when he was briefly cared for by Patrick. Left alone in Patrick's rock, Gary wandered its barren, sandy interior with a look of thinly veiled disdain. There were no books, no cozy corners, not even proper food. Yet even here, Gary remained composed. He slid into the corners, studied Patrick's odd furniture, and waited patiently for SpongeBob's return. For Gary, exploration wasn't always about joy. Sometimes it was about endurance. Yet his greatest adventures were always tied to his bond with SpongeBob. When SpongeBob became lost or overwhelmed, Gary would sometimes leave the safety of the pineapple to find him. One evening, when SpongeBob failed to return from the Krusty Krab on time, Gary slithered into the street, following the familiar scent of grease and sea salt. The night was dark, the currents unusually strong, but Gary pressed on until he reached the restaurant's glowing windows. There, he found SpongeBob mopping floors long past, closing, tired and drooping. A sharp meow from the doorway brought SpongeBob's eyes wide with relief. "Gary! You came for me! SpongeBob cried, scooping him up. To SpongeBob, it was love. To Gary, it was simply instinct, ND2, the natural pull of an explorer returning his family to safety. Gary's journeys also revealed a kind of independence few pets ever showed. While SpongeBob's world revolved around work, friends, and play, Gary's was quieter, more inward. Yet, when he ventured into the unknown, he proved himself capable of so much more. He could navigate danger, resist temptation, and always find his way back home. His explorations weren't just wanderings. They were tests of resilience, moments where Gary proved to himself, and to SpongeBob, that he was more than a pet. He was a companion, a partner, and sometimes even a guide. One evening, after another long day, SpongeBob found Gary perched by the window, his eyes gazing out at the dim glow of Bikini Bottom streets. "Thinking of another adventure, Gare?" SpongeBob asked softly. Gary blinked, his shell glinting faintly in the moonlight. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he was simply remembering the paths he had already travelled, the roads that had tested him, and the home that had welcomed him back each time. Gary's life was full of cosy comforts, food bowls, warm rugs, and SpongeBob's love. But beneath it all, he carried the heart of an explorer. He had faced the wide ocean, strange creatures, and the loneliness of wandering. Each journey shaped him, reminding him, and us, that even the smallest creatures can carry the courage to explore, endure, and always find their way home. Bikini Bottom had always been a town alive with sound. Squidward's clarinet notes floated sour through the streets, SpongeBob's laughter rang bright as bells, and Patrick's off-key humming drifted from under his rock. But hidden in the corners of this noisy little world was another musician, one who rarely drew attention, yet whose contributions brought warmth and rhythm to SpongeBob's life. Gary, quiet as he was, carried a musical spirit that revealed itself in small but unforgettable moments. Gary's first brush with music came in the simplest way, his meows. While most assumed them to be mere pet sounds, those who listened closely heard melody in them. SpongeBob, especially, swore that Gary's meows carried notes, rising and falling like a tune. In the mornings, as SpongeBob prepared for work, Gary's mews often matched the rhythm of SpongeBob's humming. The two would fill the pineapple with a strange duet, SpongeBob loud and cheerful, Gary soft and steady, their voices weaving together in a quiet harmony that only they seemed to notice. But Gary's talents went far beyond meowing in key. In As Seen on Television, when SpongeBob basked in the glow of unexpected fame, Gary revealed a talent that startled even Squidward. As SpongeBob performed a song, Gary appeared with a clarinet, playing with surprising skill. Where Squidward's attempts often squeaked and groaned, Gary's notes rang smooth, almost elegant. The crowd applauded, not realizing the true miracle before them. A snail, more musically gifted than the town's self-proclaimed artist. That wasn't his only instrument. Gary displayed flair with percussion too. On more than one occasion, SpongeBob caught him tapping objects in rhythm, drumming on shells, jars, or bowls with the precision of a practiced musician. During SpongeBob's Best Day Ever performance, Gary joined in, adding sound and spirit to the ensemble. It wasn't flashy, but it was steady, the kind of rhythm that carried the song forward. Gary, it seemed, had an ear not just for melody, but for balance, supporting the music rather than overwhelming it. His talent with song was most evident during the quieter moments. In the evenings, when SpongeBob strummed a guitar or played recordings, Gary often purred in harmony. It was subtle, a low, rumbling sound that fit beneath the melody like a bass line. SpongeBob once paused mid-song, blinking in wonder. "Gare, are you singing with me?" Gary blinked back, letting out another perfectly timed note. From then on, SpongeBob often invited him to join his nightly tunes, calling him my musical partner. There was even a time when Gary danced. In Gary's new toy, SpongeBob bought his snail a ball that squeaked a rhythmic tune. To SpongeBob's astonishment, Gary bounced in time with the squeaks, sliding left and right, creating a kind of snail dance. It wasn't clumsy or accidental. It matched the rhythm perfectly, a display of natural musicality. SpongeBob clapped and cheered, declaring Gary a natural-born star. And though Gary quickly grew tired of the toy, the image of him moving to music lingered. Gary's connection to music also seemed to influence SpongeBob himself. Whenever SpongeBob prepared for a performance, Gary often sat nearby, watching quietly. SpongeBob claimed he drew courage from that steady gaze, as if Gary's presence kept him in tune. "You're my lucky charm, Gare," SpongeBob whispered once before a jellyfish jam. And sure enough, with Gary in the audience, SpongeBob's songs always seemed brighter, his voice steadier. But perhaps Gary's greatest musical adventure came during the many sing-along episodes that defined SpongeBob's world. When the entire town joined in, Gary never sat idly by. Whether with a meow, a purr, or even a clarinet note, he always contributed. It was his way of reminding everyone that music wasn't about perfection. It was about joining in, finding harmony in shared voices, no matter how small. What made Gary's musicality special was not that he could play instruments or match rhythms, though those feats were impressive enough. It was that his music came from the same place his wisdom did: quiet observation. He didn't push forward, didn't demand the spotlight. He simply listened, felt, and added his voice where it mattered most. Music, for Gary, was not a performance, but a way of belonging. One night, long after the noise of Bikini Bottom had faded, SpongeBob sat on the edge of his bed with a small ukulele. He strummed softly, humming a tune half-formed. Gary slid closer, curling at SpongeBob's feet. As the melody drifted into the quiet, Gary purred a note in harmony. SpongeBob's smile widened. "Thanks, Gare," he whispered. "It's better with you." Together, they played and sang into the night, not for crowds or fame, but simply for each other. In a town filled with big personalities and louder voices, Gary's contributions could have been overlooked, yet those who listened closely knew the truth. Bikini Bottom's quietest resident carried music in his heart. His meows were melodies, his purrs were bass lines, his clarinet notes soared, and his presence gave rhythm to SpongeBob's world. For all his hidden talents, perhaps none were as magical as this. The snail who turned silence into song, and who reminded everyone that music lives even in the quietest corners of the sea. Though Gary was most often seen by SpongeBob's side, he was not without connections of his own. In fact, Gary's quiet nature and steady presence allowed him to form unusual friendships with characters across Bikini Bottom, some expected and others surprising. These bonds, while often understated, gave depth to his life and showed that even a snail could have a circle of friends. One of Gary's earliest bonds beyond SpongeBob came with Patrick. The starfish wasn't exactly known for his patience or attentiveness, but he shared with Gary something important: loyalty. In the Great Snail Race, Patrick cheered Gary on with genuine excitement, despite his own pet, Rocky, being little more than a rock. Patrick clapped and shouted, proud to see Gary shine. Their connection wasn't deep in conversation. Patrick never quite understood Gary's meows, but it was rooted in respect. Patrick saw Gary as more than a pet. He saw him as part of SpongeBob's family, and therefore part of his own. Their friendship grew stronger in moments when Patrick was tasked with looking after Gary. In Pet Sitter Pat, SpongeBob entrusted Patrick with Gary's care, which led, unsurprisingly, to chaos. Patrick misunderstood Gary's needs, nearly losing him in the process. Yet despite the mishaps, there was an odd kind of bond between them. Gary tolerated Patrick's blunders with remarkable patience, his narrowed eyes and unimpressed meows silently communicating what words could not, he would endure. And when SpongeBob returned, Gary didn't hold grudges. He understood that Patrick's heart was clumsy, but not unkind. Squidward, on the other hand, shared with Gary a quieter kind of relationship. Squidward rarely had patience for SpongeBob's antics, but he seemed to respect Gary's calm demeanour. Unlike SpongeBob's constant cheer or Patrick's noisy chaos, Gary brought stillness to the pineapple next door. In moments when SpongeBob's antics spilled over into Squidward's life, Gary sometimes became the unexpected bridge. Squidward would grumble, but a snail's slow blink or unimpressed stare often mirrored Squidward's own frustration. It was almost as if the two shared a silent camaraderie, both long-suffering souls in a sea of absurdity. Though Squidward would never admit it, he seemed to regard Gary with more respect than most. Another meaningful friendship bloomed with Sandy Cheeks. The Texan squirrel, scientist and adventurer, admired intelligence wherever she found it. And Gary, in his quiet way, displayed intelligence that often surpassed SpongeBob's time. Sandy once remarked that Gary has more sense than half the town put together, and she meant it. She seemed to recognize his wisdom, and in return, Gary respected her sharp mind. On visits to Sandy's tree dome, Gary often meowed softly, settling into her peaceful home as if it were another haven. Their friendship wasn't loud or frequent, but it was rooted in mutual understanding. Plankton, surprisingly, also shared interactions with Gary. In Plankton's pet, Plankton adopted Spot, a microscopic amoeba, as his companion. When Spot later crossed paths with Gary, the two creatures seemed to acknowledge one another with quiet curiosity. Gary's steady gaze met Spot's wiggle, and for a moment there was a sense of kinship between pets, both loyal to their owners, both overlooked in the shadow of louder personalities. Though they belonged to different worlds, their brief connection hinted at a broader community of creatures who understood one another beyond words. Gary also showed kindness toward smaller critters in Bikini Bottom. In Gary in Love, when he met Mary the Snail, he revealed a softer side. Gary, often stoic and reserved, became shy and gentle, meowing sweetly as he tried to impress her. Their bond, brief though it was, demonstrated his capacity for affection. It wasn't just SpongeBob who held his heart. Gary was capable of forming connections with others, even if those connections were fleeting. One of his most unusual friendships came with Grandma in Have You Seen This Snail? Though their relationship began as one of survival, Gary finding food and shelter after leaving home, it grew into something more tender. Grandma showered Gary with love, treats, and constant attention, and though it became overwhelming, Gary responded with patience. He allowed her to knit him sweaters, feed him cookies, and tuck him into bed. It was not the same as SpongeBob's love, but it was genuine in its own way. Gary's ability to accept affection, even when overbearing, showed the quiet generosity at the heart of his friendships. Even SpongeBob's nemesis, Mr. Krabs, had moments of appreciation for Gary. In the Great Snail Race, when Gary displayed his determination, Mr. Krabs tipped his hat with respect. Gary wasn't just another pet, he had earned admiration, and while Mr. Krabs rarely showed sentiment, his acknowledgement mattered. It proved that Gary's presence extended beyond SpongeBob's home and touched even those hardened by greed. Through all these relationships, one thing remained clear. Gary had a way of forming connections without noise, without boasting, without demanding attention. His friendships were quiet, steady, and built on respect. Whether it was tolerating Patrick's mishaps, sharing silence with Squidward, admiring Sandy's intelligence, or receiving Grandma's overwhelming affection, Gary always responded with patience. He seemed to understand that friendship was not about perfection, but about presence. One evening, as SpongeBob hosted a small gathering of friends in the pineapple, Gary curled on his rug, watching them all. Patrick laughed loudly, Squidward sighed dramatically, Sandy shared a clever observation, and SpongeBob beamed with joy. Gary blinked slowly, content. These were not just SpongeBob's friends. They were his, too. a strange, messy, loving family that had grown around him over the years. And in that moment, Gary reminded us all that friendship doesn't need words. It doesn't need grand gestures or endless chatter. Sometimes it simply needs a steady presence, a patient gaze, and a quiet heart. In that sense, Gary may have been the truest friend of all. For all the warmth and comfort that SpongeBob's pineapple provided, Gary's life was not without hardship. Behind his slow blinks and quiet meows lay a story marked by challenges, moments that tested his patience, his loyalty, and even his very survival. Gary's trials were not loud battles or dramatic showdowns. They were subtler, quieter struggles, but no less significant. And through them all, Gary revealed a resilience few would expect from such a small creature. One of his most painful trials came during the events of Have You Seen This Snail? In that story, Gary endured neglect, not out of malice, but distraction. SpongeBob became obsessed with a toy paddle ball, so focused on setting a world record that he forgot to feed his beloved snail. The days stretched long, Gary's bowl remained empty, and his meows went unanswered. For any pet, such moments are lonely, but for Gary, who was more than a simple animal, who thought and felt deeply, it was devastating. His slow departure from the pineapple that day was not rebellion, but heartbreak. And yet, even as he wandered the unfamiliar streets of Bikini Bottom, he showed resilience. He endured hunger, found shelter, and pressed on until, eventually, he discovered Grandma's house. Though this trial nearly cost him his bond with SpongeBob, Gary's endurance and forgiving heart carried him through. Another trial came in Dumped, when SpongeBob, in his eagerness to give Patrick more attention, seemed to replace Gary with a new pet. At first, SpongeBob showered Patrick's pet with love, doting on him while Gary looked on in disbelief. It was a betrayal not born of cruelty, but of thoughtlessness. Gary's quiet heartache in that episode was almost palpable, too. The way he meowed with sorrow, the way his eyes drooped as he slid away. And yet, Gary's response was not revenge. He didn't lash out or cause chaos. Instead, he withdrew, enduring the pain until SpongeBob finally realized his mistake. The trial of being overlooked was perhaps one of Gary's greatest tests, but his loyalty never wavered. He returned to SpongeBob, not with resentment, but with love. There were trials of danger too. In A Pal for Gary, SpongeBob's misguided attempt to bring home Puffy Fluffy nearly cost Gary his safety. Left alone with the monstrous creature, Gary was terrorized in his own home, chased and cornered by a beast that SpongeBob refused to see for what it truly was. This was a trial of survival. Gary had to rely on his instincts, his cleverness, and his sheer will to endure the ordeal. His victory wasn't one of strength, but of wit, using his slime trail and quick thinking to outmaneuver Puffy Fluffy. Though traumatizing, this trial revealed Gary's quiet courage, his ability to fight back when there was no one else to defend him. Sometimes Gary's trials were smaller, but no less frustrating. In Gary Takes a Bath, SpongeBob's overzealous attempts to bathe his snail became a marathon of tricks and traps. To many, it was comedy. But for Gary, it was a test of patience. He darted around the house, evading SpongeBob's schemes, using every ounce of his wit to maintain control of his dignity. It was not just about avoiding water. It was about standing his ground. For Gary, whose life was often dictated by others, this was a moment to assert his independence. Even his health became a trial at times. In treats, Gary developed an obsession with snail treats, demanding more and more with increasing desperation. It was a test of appetite and willpower, showing how even the gentlest creatures could falter when temptation grew too strong. SpongeBob struggled to keep him healthy, while Gary's cravings nearly overpowered him. Yet in the end, Gary found balance again, proving that even his weakest moments could be overcome with care and persistence. Perhaps one of Gary's most defining trials was loneliness. Despite SpongeBob's love, there were times when Gary was left alone for long stretches, his world quiet and empty. In those moments, he had only himself for company. Loneliness, for any creature, is a heavy burden, yet Gary bore it with grace. He found ways to occupy himself, to reading books, solving puzzles, or simply curling up in quiet reflection. His resilience in solitude showed that strength is not always measured in grand gestures, but in the ability to endure silence without despair. Through all these trials, one quality shone brightest in Gary: forgiveness. No matter how many times SpongeBob failed him, by neglecting him, replacing him, or misunderstanding his needs, Gary always returned with love. He never closed his heart, never turned away. His quiet resilience was not only about survival, but about compassion. He endured hardships, and instead of growing bitter, he grew wiser. One evening, after another exhausting day, SpongeBob sat at the edge of his bed, sighing. "I'm sorry for everything I put you through, Gare," he whispered. Gary slid close, curling at SpongeBob's side. A soft meow broke the silence, gentle and forgiving. In that simple sound was the lesson Gary had carried through every trial. Love endures, even when tested. Gary's trials shaped him into more than just a pet. They revealed his strength, his patience, his cleverness, and his boundless heart. Each hardship, whether hunger, neglect, danger, or loneliness, was met with quiet resilience. And though he bore no scars to show it, those who knew his story understood Gary was far stronger than he appeared. For much of his life, Gary seemed content to let SpongeBob fill the room with his boundless energy. He watched from rugs and windowsills, his eyes half closed, his meows soft and measured. To the untrained eye, he looked passive, a pet with no larger role than to purr and nap, but the truth was far deeper. Gary carried within him the quiet heart of a hero, not the kind who boasted or wore armor, but the kind who acted when no one else could, whose courage appeared precisely when it was most needed. One of Gary's most heroic moments came in A Pal for Gary. Faced with Puffy Fluffy, a creature so terrifying that even SpongeBob refused to see its danger, Gary alone stood against it. This was not a playful scuffle. Puffy Fluffy grew monstrous, eyes glowing and teeth gnashing, stalking Gary through every room of the pineapple. SpongeBob, oblivious, encouraged the playdate, blind to the truth. But Gary knew better. When Puffy Fluffy finally cornered SpongeBob, baring its fangs, Gary sprang into action. With a sharp hiss and quick thinking, he turned his slime trail into a trap, tangling the beast and pulling SpongeBob to safety. In that moment, Gary wasn't just defending himself. It's 70, he was protecting his owner, saving SpongeBob from a danger he didn't even recognize. It was one of the rare times Gary's loyalty turned to fierce, visible bravery. In the Great Snail Race, Gary proved his heroism in a quieter way. Pushed too hard by SpongeBob's ambition, Gary nearly collapsed under the pressure of training. Yet when the race began, and SpongeBob realized the mistake of pushing his pet beyond his limits, Gary still found the strength to cross the finish line. It wasn't about winning, it was about showing determination in the face of exhaustion. Though his body was weak, his spirit carried him forward. To SpongeBob, it was a lesson in love and humility. To the crowd, it was a reminder that true victory lies not in trophies, but in heart. Gary also revealed his protective instincts in Your Shoes Untied. When SpongeBob lost the ability to tie his shoes, Gary noticed his frustration. While the rest of Bikini Bottom laughed at SpongeBob's fumbling, Gary patiently guided him. He didn't mock or sigh. Instead, he used his shell and movements to show SpongeBob the steps he had forgotten. In this small act, Gary became a quiet teacher, lifting SpongeBob out of despair. It wasn't a grand rescue from danger, but it was a hero's deed nonetheless, restoring confidence to someone he loved. Then there was Have You Seen This Snail?, where Gary's endurance during his runaway journey became heroic in its own right. Alone, hungry, and vulnerable, he managed to navigate the dangers of Bikini Bottom until he found shelter. Though Grandma's house provided food, her smothering affection nearly overwhelmed him. Gary, however, resisted. He knew that his true home was with SpongeBob, and with quiet bravery, he turned away from comfort to return to love. The journey back, filled with uncertainty, was itself an act of heroism. It showed that sometimes the bravest choice is not to stay where it's easy, but to travel the harder road home. Even in moments of humour, Gary's heroism shone through. In Gary Takes a Bath, SpongeBob's relentless schemes could have worn down any creature. But Gary, refusing to yield, transformed his resistance into a battle of wits. By turning every trap against SpongeBob, Gary taught his owner that respect mattered more than control. It was not just defiance, it was a hero's lesson in boundaries. Gary's heroism extended beyond SpongeBob as well. In Gary in Love, he pursued Mary the Snail, competing with other suitors. Though it may have seemed a simple tale of affection, Gary's perseverance was heroic in its own right. He faced rivals, rejection, and the awkwardness of opening his heart. Yet he pressed on. His bravery wasn't in combat, but in vulnerability, in risking his feelings for the chance at love. What made Gary's heroism unique was that it never sought recognition. He didn't expect applause or thanks. After saving SpongeBob from Puffy Fluffy, he simply meowed, curling up as though nothing had happened. After crossing the finish line in the snail race, he rested quietly, unfazed by the cheers around him. For Gary, being a hero was not about pride. It was about duty, instinct, and love. One evening, SpongeBob sat with Gary on the pineapple floor, stroking his shell. "You're my hero, Gare," SpongeBob whispered. Gary blinked, his eyes calm and knowing. To him, heroism wasn't about titles. It was about being there when it mattered most. And that he had always done. Gary's heroism wasn't loud, dramatic, or flashy. It was quiet, patient, and steadfast. He was the kind of hero who saved with wit instead of force, with love instead of pride. In his own unassuming way, Gary reminded Bikini Bottom, IMC, and all of us that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who ask for nothing, but give everything. When people think of SpongeBob SquarePants, they often picture the laughter, the bright colours, and the wild adventures that stretch across Bikini Bottom. They remember SpongeBob's bubbling energy, Patrick's carefree foolishness, or Squidward's endless sighs. Yet, in the background, steady and unassuming, there has always been Gary, the snail who rarely sought attention, who never demanded the spotlight, nevertheless left a legacy as rich and lasting as any other character in the sea. Gary's story was not about fame or glory, but about quiet resilience. He wasn't the hero who fought sea monsters or discovered lost cities. He was the one who endured trials patiently, who faced danger with wit, and who offered comfort when words weren't enough. Through all his adventures, from surviving Puffy Fluffy to winning SpongeBob's heart back after neglect, Gary revealed that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's loud and visible. Other times it's quiet and constant, flowing beneath the surface like an unseen current. At the heart of Gary's legacy was loyalty. No matter how often SpongeBob blundered, forgetting meals, pushing him too hard in the snail race, or trusting the wrong creatures, Gary never abandoned him. Even when he wandered away, as in, "Have you seen this snail?" his heart led him back. His loyalty was not blind. He felt hurt. He knew when he was mistreated, and he made his voice known through sharp meows or narrowed eyes. Yet forgiveness always followed. That balance of self-respect and devotion, espeba, was what made his loyalty so powerful. It wasn't the loyalty of a pet, it was the loyalty of a true companion. Gary also left a legacy of intelligence. From reading books to playing instruments, from solving problems to outsmarting villains, Gary quietly proved himself to be among the most intelligent residents of Bikini Bottom. His wit often surpassed SpongeBob's, and even Squidward, proud of his intellect, begrudgingly recognized Gary's cleverness. Children watching the show often smiled in surprise at his hidden talents. Adults chuckled knowingly, realizing that Gary was far more than a simple snail. In every meow, there seemed to be wisdom, as though he understood the world better than most who bustled noisily around him. Another part of Gary's legacy was his patience. He endured SpongeBob's frantic love, Patrick's clumsy caretaking, Squidward's dismissive glances, and even Bikini Bottom's occasional chaos. Through it all, he never lost his composure. His eyes would blink slowly, his meows would carry just the right weight, and in that patience, he taught a quiet lesson. Not every problem requires noise. Sometimes calm, endurance, and stillness are the strongest answers. Gary's adventures also made him a symbol of independence. Though bonded to SpongeBob, he was not defined by him. Episodes like Gary Takes Charge showed that he could manage a household, care for himself, and even lead others. He was not simply SpongeBob's pet, but a creature with his own agency, his own choices. That independence elevated him from side character to someone essential in his own right. In the films, Gary's role expanded even further. In the SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, his kidnapping by King Poseidon became the driving force of the story. Every step of SpongeBob's journey was motivated by the love he held for his snail. That film elevated Gary's importance. He wasn't just background, he was the heart. Without him, SpongeBob's courage might never have shone so brightly. Through Gary, the show reminded audiences that sometimes the smallest characters carry the greatest weight. And perhaps that is Gary's true legacy. He showed that greatness does not always roar. It doesn't always sing or boast or laugh the loudest. Sometimes greatness is quiet. It's the soft meow in the night when SpongeBob feels lonely. It's the patient gaze when friends quarrel. It's the resilience of surviving trials, the cleverness to outwit danger, and the love that never fades, no matter how often it's tested. Gary's story also mirrored the hearts of viewers. Pets across the world, from cats to dogs to fish, held that same quiet loyalty. Children watching saw their own companions in Gary's shell and eyes. Adults remembered the bond of a loyal animal who asked for little but gave so much. In that way, Gary transcended his role as a cartoon snail. He became a symbol of love, companionship, and the quiet heroism found in everyday life. One evening, SpongeBob curled on the couch, Gary purring softly at his side. "You're the best part of my life, Gar," SpongeBob whispered. Gary blinked, his eyes heavy with the calm wisdom that had carried him through so many trials. In that simple moment, Gary's legacy was written, not in applause, not in grand adventures, but in love shared quietly, every day, between friends. So as the lights dim in Bikini Bottom and the waves grow still, Gary's story continues. Not with battles or trophies, but with the quiet strength of a creature who was always more than he seemed. His legacy is patience, loyalty, intelligence, and love. A snail who taught us that even the smallest voice can echo forever if it speaks from the heart.